This presentation is just an outline of the flow of blood through the heart. Let's just take a look at the basic schematic diagram here, although not anatomically correct, good for just a outline. So we have the four chambers of the heart. We have two atriums, two ventricles, and we have left and right sides. Just make note that the right side of the heart, the right atrium and the right ventricle, is always going to contain deoxygenated blood, where the left atrium and the left ventricle will contain oxygenated blood. Also note that there are two sets of valves. There are the tri- and bicuspid valves, and there are the semilunar valves. The tricuspid and bicuspid are known as AV valves because they are between the atrium and the ventricle, atrioventricular valves. The semilunar valves are going to be between the ventricles and the outflow vessels, either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. So we have two chambers called atrium, two chambers called ventricles, and we have left and right. Now let's look at the exchange of oxygen and CO2 at the body cells and at the lungs. So we have oxygenated blood coming in to the system, and that oxygen will leave the blood and go into the cells. That oxygen combines with glucose and is metabolized to CO2 and water, and the CO2 will then leave the cells and go into the blood. So the blood leaving the cells is now going to be deoxygenated. At the lungs, what's happening is the deoxygenated blood coming into the lungs, accepts the oxygen that is going to diffuse into the blood from the lungs. We have inhaled oxygenated air, and the CO2 will then leave the blood and go into the lungs to be exhaled. So deoxygenated blood coming into the lungs, and then we have oxygenated blood leaving the lungs. So if you look at the movement of CO2 and oxygen from the blood into the blood, it's opposite in the body cells and in the lungs, which I will illustrate in a diagram on the next slide. Let's examine the exchange of oxygen and CO2 at the lungs versus at the cells. So we're looking at pulmonary versus systemic. So the air that we breathe in is oxygen rich, and that oxygen will diffuse from the lungs into the blood. The CO2 is going to exit the blood, go into the lungs, and be exhaled. At the cells, oxygen rich blood coming in will release that oxygen and diffuse into the cell. The cell will utilize that oxygen through cellular respiration with glucose to form CO2 and water, and the CO2 will then diffuse from the cell back into the blood. Let's look at this another way, another diagram, same story. During inhalation, we breathe in oxygen-rich air, and that oxygen is going to diffuse from the lungs into the blood. That blood is then going to return to the left side of the heart and then be pumped out to the system and be returned to the cells. That oxygen then diffuses into the cell, and therefore the blood leaving the cell is going to be deoxygenated. It returns to the right side of the heart and then will be pumped out back to the lungs. So again, looking at this, we can see that the right side of the heart is deoxygenated, the left side of the heart is oxygenated, and what this particularly shows is the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary is to and from the lungs, systemic is to and from the cells. Noting that the pulmonary and systemic both have an oxygenated and a deoxygenated component, and both have a left and right side of the heart involved. Back to the original diagram, let's look at the flow of blood through the heart. So we're going to start at the body cells. The cells have utilized the oxygen, so the blood leaving the cells is going to be deoxygenated. It returns to the heart from the lower part of the body through the inferior vena cava, and from the upper part of the body through the superior vena cava, going into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then out of the heart via the pulmonary semilunar valve. It goes to the lungs, at which point it is going to pick up oxygen and therefore leaving it will be oxygenated, returning to the left atrium through the bicuspid or mitral valve, out the aortic semilunar valve via the aorta. It is then distributed to the body and returns to the cells. The oxygen then goes into the cells, and blood leaving the cells will be deoxygenated. By definition, arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins carry blood to the heart. If we look in a general sense, we can note that most arteries are going to be oxygenated and most veins are going to be deoxygenated. However, if we take a closer look at this diagram, we can see the two exceptions, and this is going to be the pulmonary vein, which is actually oxygenated, and the pulmonary artery, which is deoxygenated. And this is because they are involved with the pulmonary circuit taking blood to and from the lungs. Here's one more diagram just summarizing the flow of blood through the heart. We have deoxygenated blood leaving the left ventricle going to the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated and returns to the heart via the left atrium, pumped out of the heart via the left ventricle going to the cells utilizing the oxygen, and the deoxygenated blood returning to the right atrium. Pulmonary and systemic circulation is shown here, pulmonary to and from the lungs, systemic to and from the cells. For completion, let's just add the names of the vessels that are carrying blood. So the pulmonary circuit is going to be the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein, noting that this is the exception to the rule that oxygenated blood is carried by arteries and deoxygenated blood is carried by veins. The main vessel carrying blood out of the left ventricle is the aorta, and returning via the vena cava. And that's that.